History's most shocking military disappearances. What really happened to these soldiers? The thing about Cambyses II is that he doesn't get nearly enough credit for being one of history's most spectacularly bad decision makers. And the army he lost in the Sahara in 525 BC is probably the cleanest example of what I mean by that. 50,000 men. That's the number Herodotus gives, which means you should immediately be skeptical of it. But even if you cut it in half, even if you cut it to a quarter, you're still talking about an army that walked into the western desert of Egypt and simply didn't come back. Cambyses had sent them from Thebes to destroy the Oracle of Amun at Siwa. The Oracle had said something unflattering about him. Accounts vary on exactly what, and Cambyses was the kind of person who responded to bad prophecy by trying to kill the prophet. The army left. No survivors returned. No messenger. No explanation. The desert just absorbed them, and that was it. The modern discovery in 2009 claimed to have found mass graves near Siwash. Bones, weapons, a bronze dagger. But the archaeological community was not exactly rushing to confirm this. And the guys who made the announcement were brothers running a private expedition, which is not the pedigree that tends to hold up. So we still don't actually know. Sandstorm is the most common explanation. It's also the most convenient explanation, which makes me trust it slightly less than I probably should. The Norfolks are stranger, and stranger in a way that's harder to shake. August 12th, 1915. Suvla Bay, Gallipoli. The 1st/5th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment, 267 men including their commanding officer, Colonel Sir Horace Beauchamps, advanced into an orchard near Kuchik Anafarta and were not seen again. Not retreated, not captured in large numbers, not found dead in the following days. Gone. Beauchamp had personally led them forward. Nobody came back out of the orchard, no. The story that spread afterward, and this is where it gets uncomfortable to write about, involves a cloud. A group of New Zealand soldiers claimed they watched the Norfolks march into a strange, self-contained cloud that sat low on the ground, and that the cloud then slowly drifted away, and the men were gone. This is in a 1965 letter signed by 3 veterans, written 50 years after the fact. I don't know what to do with this. It's almost certainly wrong, but it's also the kind of thing that, once you've read it, you can't read anything else about the Norfolks without it sitting there in the back of your mind like a piece of grit. The real explanation is almost certainly less interesting and considerably more brutal. They were probably killed by Ottoman forces in the confusion of the advance. Scattered. The bodies left in terrain that changed hands multiple times and was never properly searched. In 1919, after the armistice, a graves registration unit found 180 bodies near Kuchik Anafarta that were identified as Norfolks. But that's 87 men still unaccounted for, and Beauchamp was not among the remains found. So the cloud is wrong, but the question it's attached to isn't entirely closed, which is the most irritating combination of things I know how to describe. Verdun is different from everything else on this list because the men at Verdun didn't disappear in any mysterious sense. They were obliterated. The distinction matters. By 1916, the artillery had become so dense, and the shelling so sustained, that units were simply ceasing to exist in ways that didn't leave enough behind to count. The 137th Infantry Regiment went into the line in June and lost 97% of its strength in 11 days. Not 97% killed, 97% casualties, killed, wounded, missing. But missing at Verdun often meant shelled to the point where there was nothing to find. The French army rotated something like 70% of its total force through Verdun at some point during the battle, which was intentional. Petain's policy was to cycle units out before they broke completely, but it also meant that the losses were distributed across the entire French military in a way that's almost impossible to total accurately even now. There are 9 villages under the forest at Verdun. 9 villages that were shelled so completely, with so many unrecovered bodies in the soil, that the French government declared the land permanently uninhabitable after the war. They're still there. The villages are still listed in French administrative records as communes with no inhabitants, governed by councils composed entirely of the dead, the last residents before the shelling, their names maintained on the official rolls because there was nobody left to remove them. I don't have a joke for that. I don't think it needs one. Alexander's disaster in the Gedrosian desert in 325 BC may have killed more people than every battle he ever fought combined. Arrian says this directly. He doesn't phrase it as a possibility. He says it. The estimates for how many people died vary enormously because the sources disagree, and because a significant portion of the dead were not soldiers. Alexander marched his army, the fleet's support train, camp followers, wives, children, merchants, servants, the entire moving city that followed a Macedonian campaign, through a desert in summer with provisions that ran out almost immediately. The army ate the pack animals, then they ate the baggage animals. Then they drank seawater because there wasn't anything else, which made things worse in the way that drinking seawater makes things worse. Soldiers were found asleep on the march and buried alive by sand before anyone noticed they'd fallen. The women and children who had followed the campaign from Macedonia died in flash floods from wadis that filled without warning in the night. Alexander had been told the route was passable. He'd been told there were provisions. He may have also been trying to do something Cyrus the Great had attempted and failed, which would make the decision partly about ego, which is the kind of thing that gets 100,000 people killed, and then gets described in the sources as bold strategy. The 9th Legion disappears from the Roman historical record sometime around 120 AD, and nobody has agreed on why in the 2,000 years since. Legio Nona Hispana was one of Rome's oldest legions. It had fought in Britain since the invasion under Claudius in 43 AD, suppressed Boudicca's revolt, campaigned across the north. Then somewhere after 108 AD, the last date it appears in a British inscription, it stops appearing anywhere. No record of it being disbanded. No record of a catastrophic defeat. No triumphal account of whoever destroyed it. It's just gone. The way a name goes missing from a list and you're never sure if it was removed or simply never added back. The romantic version of the story, the one that became a novel and then a film, is that the 9th marched north of Hadrian's Wall into Caledonia and was annihilated by the Picts. Their eagle lost. Rome too embarrassed to record it. This is a satisfying story. It is probably not true. Most contemporary historians think the legion was transferred out of Britain, possibly to the eastern frontier, possibly to the Rhineland, and destroyed there, in Judea or in one of the catastrophic wars of the 120s and 130s. The evidence for this is fragmentary and none of it is conclusive. Tiles stamped with the 9th's mark have been found in the Netherlands, dated to the early 2nd century, which suggests they were at least briefly somewhere other than Britain. That's it. Tiles. There is something particularly Roman about this. That a unit of 6,000 men, one of the instruments of the world's largest empire, could simply cease to be documented, and the empire would carry on without ever explaining what happened to it. The paperwork just moves on. The Tristán de Luna expedition to Florida in 1559 lasted 2 years and accomplished essentially nothing, which makes it a failure rather than a mystery. But the specific texture of how it failed is worth dwelling on. De Luna sailed from Veracruz with 1,500 soldiers and colonists, and enough supplies to establish a permanent Spanish settlement on the Gulf Coast. They landed at Pensacola Bay in August 1559. A month later, a hurricane came through and destroyed most of the supply fleet while it was still in harbor. The colonists had already moved their supplies ashore, which saved some of it, but the ships were gone, which meant the resupply route was gone, which meant everything that came after was operating on borrowed time. What followed was 2 years of slow dissolution. De Luna sent parties inland looking for food, and found a Coosa town that had been prosperous a generation earlier, and was now nearly abandoned. A previous Spanish expedition had disrupted the trade networks badly enough that the population had scattered. His soldiers mutinied. His officers attempted to relieve him of command on the grounds that he was making decisions that suggested either serious illness or a complete mental breakdown. The historical record doesn't clearly establish which. The remaining colonists eventually refused to plant crops, which is a striking thing for a group of people facing starvation to decide. And the reasoning given in the sources is essentially that they considered agricultural labor beneath them. The Spanish crown sent a ship in 1561 to evacuate whoever remained. The settlement had been abandoned. Florida would stay unconquered for another 5 years, which from the perspective of everyone involved seems like it was probably the right outcome.